Our final workshop session of this afternoon is titled Springboard to the Future, Women in American Politics. Dr. Susan Hartman is a Emerita Professor of History at The Ohio State University, who specializes in 20th century American history and women's history. She's published several books, including From Margin to Mainstream, American Women and Politics since 1960, and The Other Feminists. Her current research deals with gender and the reshaping of U.S. politics and policy after World War II. Professor Hartman is a fellow of the Society of American Historians and has received awards from the Rockefeller Foundation, the National Endowment of the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars. She also has a Distinguished Service Award from the Ohio State University. She also has completed the New York City Marathon. Dr. Susan Hartman.
Thank you. I'm very happy. Okay. I want to thank Gary Iams for inviting me. I want to thank the sponsors of this wonderful symposium, and also Dave Claiborne for resurrecting my PowerPoint when I didn't think I would have one. After the 19th Amendment was ratified, one of the suffrage leaders, Carrie Chapman Catt, looked back on that struggle with awe. This is what she said: "How much time and patience, how much work, energy, and aspiration, how much faith, how much hope, how much despair went into it. Its success became a monumental thing." In some ways, suffrage was a monumental thing. Half of the population was enfranchised, the largest expansion of the vote ever in American history. Women's relationship with the state was altered dramatically, and male monopoly of the public sphere ended. National political parties had to take account of women voters now, as evidenced in this ad that appeared in a sewing magazine on the uptake to the 1920 election. Harding even devoted one of his front porch events here at home exclusively to women. He addressed some 5,000 women who gathered for the speech. He talked about various issues, but he insisted that, in his words, the right of wholesome maternity was the central issue for women. And that emphasis on women's traditional motherhood, their traditional roles, is also evident in the way that the Republicans appealed to women in this ad. Here, they're really appealing to their women's supposed anti-war tendencies, emphasizing that if Harding and Coolidge are elected, the United States will stay out of war. Even the location of politics changed after suffrage. Voting was no longer conducted in barbershops and taverns, but now it was conducted in schools, in churches, in community centers. At the same time, the 19th Amendment didn't change women's political behavior as abruptly as we might think. It's easy to overstate the amount of change that came about after ratification. Before ratification of the 19th Amendment, millions of women were already voting, as this map shows. In 15 states, the white ones on the map, they had full suffrage, while in others, those in gray, Women could vote for local or state candidates, and in some cases for president. Ohio passed a presidential suffrage bill in 1917. So Ohio women would have voted in the presidential election of 1920 whether or not the 19th Amendment had been ratified. In addition, women had already been active in party politics, even when they couldn't vote. They began serving at Republican national conventions in 1900, where they could cast their own votes for the party's presidential and vice presidential nominees. Millions of women had been nonpartisan political actors since the 19th century. For example, collecting petitions to Congress for the abolition of slavery, working for prohibition, working on the local level to improve conditions in their towns and cities, and of course, lobbying and grassroots organizing for suffrage, even developing new political tactics in the process that were soon copied by men. So women did not all of a sudden become political actors. Finally, lots of women had already held political office, starting with the first woman mayor in 1887. This was in Catherine's home state of Kansas. And the first women were elected to a state legislature in Colorado in 1894. As you know, Montana had already sent Jeanette Rankin to Congress in 1917 in time for her to vote for the suffrage amendment, and also in time for her to vote against U.S. entrance into World War I. If the 19th Amendment did not initiate women's political activity and office holding, neither did it actually enfranchise all women. Ratification of the 19th Amendment secured the vote for white women, not for all women. Southern states where the vast majority of African Americans then lived, probably 90% of the population. Southern states had virtually eliminated black voting through the use of the poll tax, literacy tests, and other measures, including terror and violence. As late as 1940, 20 years after the 19th Amendment was ratified, less than 5% of the black population in the South could vote. The voting rights of Latinas, mostly in the Southwest, were obstructed by the same devices that were used to keep African Americans from voting in the South: literacy tests, poll taxes, and other devices like that. Native American women did not even have full citizenship rights when the 19th Amendment was ratified. They got those rights in 1924, but many states continued to restrict their voting rights. New Mexico was the very last state to enfranchise Native Americans, which it did in 1962. And most Asian immigrants, male or female, could not even become citizens until a series of laws passed for different groups between 1943 and 1952. What secured suffrage for most women of color was not the 19th Amendment, but the Voting Rights Act of 1965. 45 years after, nearly a half century after the 19th Amendment, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was the real enfranchisement for women of color. And that was due in large part to the efforts of black women like Fannie Lou Hamer, who risked much more than white women in order to secure the vote. In Mississippi, where Hamer tried to register to vote and led others to join the voting rights movement, she was arrested in 1963, sexually assaulted, and beaten so badly that her sister could barely recognize her. So it was in large part due to African American women, certainly not solely, but they played a huge role in the voting rights movements, being political actors even while being denied the right to vote. If it took nearly half a century for suffrage to become a reality for all women, it took that long and longer for women to catch up with men in actually using their right to vote. Shortly before ratification of the 19th Amendment, the major suffrage organization transformed itself into the League of Women Voters. The new organization focused on getting women to the polls and on making both women and men better voters by educating them about issues. The League of Women Voters also worked on a number of issues. As Catherine said, they supported the Shepard-Towner Act. They worked for equal jury service for many decades. Jury service did not automatically come with suffrage, and it was not fully realized for women on an equal basis until the 1970s. So the central purpose of the League of Women Voters was an educated electorate, and they did not discriminate between men and women in this respect. Nor did they discriminate among parties. It was strictly nonpartisan. It did encourage its members to get involved in party politics, but if a member ran for political office, she could not at the same time hold office or a leadership position in the League, nor could the League work for her election. The League has continued to play a significant role in American politics, continuing to educate voters. You might see those election guides that come out before elections, either in your cities or in the state of Ohio. The League of Women Voters does that. They resuscitated the presidential debates after they had fallen out of use after the 1960 election. It was the League of Women Voters who brought those back in the Carter Ford, thank you, election of 1976. And the League does weigh in on issues, not on candidates, but on issues. One of its current projects, in which it's very active on both the state and national levels, is an effort to do away with gerrymandering of congressional and state legislative districts, and that fair maps is one of their slogans. A second avenue into politics for women, aside from the League of Women Voters, was, of course, through political parties. One historian wrote about that movement into political parties. Women went into politics the same way they got suffrage, slowly and persistently, with great effort, against much resistance, a room at a time. And this scholar concluded that they reached the basement by the 1960s, or they had taken over the basement by the 1960s. Both parties had created separate women's divisions even before the 19th Amendment was ratified, and they subsequently mandated that each state party, needed to have a woman along with a man to represent the party on the party's national committee. But these women were often tokens. They often did the bidding of their male counterpart. Political parties rarely nominated a woman for office. usually only when it was a losing case and they couldn't find anybody else to run. They found a sacrificial lamb to put on their ticket. The parties valued women primarily for their votes and for their labor, not as decision makers or candidates. This is how the GOP praised their women mid-century. They called them the women who work on the home front, ringing the doorbells, filling out registration cards, and generally doing the housework of government. And that's what this scholar meant when she said that women had taken over the basement. They were down there doing all of the dirty work of politics. As late as the 1950s, after parties had become used to relying on women's labor to get out the vote, women were still treated as quite separate and different from men. During Eisenhower's administration in the 1950s, Republican women established what they called a kitchen cabinet to mirror appointments in Ike's cabinet. So there was one woman for every defense, labor, health, education, and welfare. There was one for every appointment to Ike's cabinet. And the kitchen cabinet sent out monthly leaflets to Republican women sharing what it called political recipes on GOP accomplishments with the housewives of the nation. And the press, too, had difficulty seeing women as political actors separate from their domestic roles. As late as 1960, the New York Times was covering women at the Republican National Convention with details about menus and headlines that read, "GOP women facing a calorie-packed week." Throughout the 1950s, women were never more than about 10% of delegates at either party's convention. And this was at a time when presidential candidates were actually chosen by delegates at the convention. As is the case for any new group of voters, women's turnout at the polls lagged behind men. Only some 9 million women voted in 1920. That was about 35% of all eligible women, compared to nearly twice as many men. And that was a situation that didn't improve a great deal over the next few decades. In 1964, however, women began to surpass men in terms of the numbers of voters. This was because there were more women in the population than there were men. It was not until 1980 that they began to vote at higher rates than men. And this gender difference in turnout continues to this day. It's not a lot, it's a few percentage points. But it meant that in the 2018 midterm elections, about 8.5 million more women voted than did men. Excuse me. What's more, as Catherine has already pointed out, in the 1980s, there began to appear what we call a gender gap in voting. In the 1980 election, women's support for Jimmy Carter surpassed men's support by 8 percentage points. Since then, women have continued to be more supportive of Democratic candidates, while men have tended to favor Republican candidates. This gap was largest so far in 2016, when 54% of women, but only 41% of men voted for Clinton, while it was just almost the obverse in terms of those who voted for Trump. Of course, there remained vast differences among women, but the women who voted Democratic did tend to share some certain characteristics. Women who favored the Democrats were more likely to work outside the home. They were more likely to be unmarried. And they were more likely to be women of color. And as Catherine already pointed out, it wasn't that women favored the Democratic Party primarily because of its position on women's rights over the last 50 years. But in part because men were moving to the Democratic Party, but women also stayed with and favored the Democratic Party because a lot of women shared its positions, a lot more women than men shared its positions on issues like gun control, the environment, war and peace, government's role in social welfare. I'm going to put a cough drop in my mouth and see if I can do two things at one time. Bear with me. Well, it took women a half century to catch up with men and then even overtake them in terms of voting clout. It took even longer for women to be represented in meaningful numbers in political office. As late as 1960, women comprised just 10% of school board members in the country, the easiest office that anyone could win, and one where you'd expect to find a lot of women. At that time, in 1960, women held less than 5% of all the seats in state legislatures. Then in the 1970s, we see the first change in women's office holding. In the 1970s, women's presence in state legislatures began to take a big leap from under 5% in 1970 to more than 20% by the 1990s. And you can see that happening fairly sharply, but then again, you see a leveling off. Today, Nevada leads the nation with 40% of its legislature women. Nevada is also the state that recently ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. And that is that is absolutely no accident. Wyoming comes in last with just over 1 in 10 of every legislator a woman. Ohio ranks around 30th in the country. Women hold 26.5% of seats in the State House. The composition by parties is interesting, not just in Ohio, but as we'll see elsewhere. In the Senate, women are equally divided between the parties, 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans. But there are more than twice as many Democratic women in the House. And this gender gap between the parties exists in other state legislatures. If you look at all the Democratic state legislators in the country, 41% of them are women. All the Democrats who serve in state legislatures, and 41% are women, really nudging up on parity. Of all the Republican state legislators, just over 17% are women. So there's a significant gender gap in elective office. Excuse me. Until the 1960s, you needed only 2 hands to count the numbers of women in Congress. I like to juxtapose these two. I could have found a photo when there were fewer women than that, but That was pretty much how they take those pictures at the beginning of every session, and that's pretty much how they looked until really getting into the 1990s. Nearly half of the women who entered Congress up through the 1950s did so literally over their husbands' dead bodies. They were appointed to finish up the terms of their deceased husbands. The majority of women came into Congress this way in the early decades. And they were expected to retire at the end of the term. Not all of them did retire. Ohio got its first Congresswoman, Frances Paine Bolton, when her husband died in office, and she decided to run for his seat. She remembered that Republican leaders were not very enthusiastic about her decision, but they went along with it, in her words, as a gracious gesture which would do them no harm, since they were sure I would get tired of politics in a few months and flit on to something else. Well, she did not flit on. She served for nearly 3 decades. But despite her successful career, it would take 3 more decades for Ohio to send its next woman to Congress. Today, Ohio has just 3 women in Congress in a delegation of 16 members. And the state has never sent a woman to the Senate. Generally, women did not begin to make real progress in Congress until the 1990s. And as always, it took longer for voters to support women of color. Patsy Mink of Hawaii was the first woman of color elected to the House 44 years after the 19th Amendment. African American Shirley Chisholm followed her in 1968. It was not until 1992 that Illinois sent the first African American woman to the Senate. And the second African American woman was just elected 3 years ago. Kamala Harris was the second African American woman elected to the Senate, and I think she was elected in 1916. 2016? Yes. 2016. I'm glad you're still alert after all these. It's been a long day for you. The first Latina was elected to Congress in 1989. And the first Native American women were elected just last year. Just 2 of them were elected in the last elections. So it took longer for women of color to win elective office, but today they do significantly well in Congress. Of all the women in Congress, more than 35% are women of color. So their representation in the last couple of decades has increased significantly. The most dramatic change in women's, as a whole, representation in Congress began in the 1990s, and today that number has grown to 25 senators, 25 out of 100, and 102 representatives, or almost 24% of Congress. The 90s is, again, if you look at the chart, you can see a big surge, and then a big surge in our very last election. As this bar graph shows, the most dramatic change came among the Democrats. again, you see this gender gap in elective office. Of the 127 women now in Congress, 21 are Republicans, 106 are Democrats. 21, 106. This is where it gets dicey because this is not the final PowerPoint that I meant to bring. So just hang on for a minute. Okay, it is. That difference, I think, is shown very clearly. That gender gap in elective office is shown very clearly here. Until around the 1980s, Republican women and Democratic women were pretty equal, just shifting back and forth a little. There were no big differences in the numbers of Republican women or the numbers of Democratic women in Congress. But in the 1980s, things begin to change quite dramatically. And again, that replicates the situation in state legislatures. The movement of women into executive offices was, if anything, slower than their entry into legislatures. Although Marion Ferguson was elected governor of Texas in 1924, just 4 years after suffrage, her husband, who had been the governor, had been impeached. And every voter knew the meaning of her campaign slogan, which was 2 governors for the price of 1. It wasn't until 1974, more than 50 years after suffrage, that the first woman was elected to the governorship in her own right. That was Ella Grasso of Connecticut. She won it all on her own. Her husband never served in political office. She called herself the first lady governor who was not first a governor's lady. And she's an example of what the League of Women Voters did for women. I mean, she had been very active. That had been her main activity. She'd been very active at the state level and even at the national level in the League of Women Voters. And eventually, she went into partisan politics and worked her way up to the governor's office. There are only 6 governors who are women today, and the most ever at any one time was 9 in 2004 and again in 2007. So executive office is elusive for women. Ohio had a governor for a few days when the real governor went off and did something. I can't remember what, and I can't even remember who it was. Maybe you remember that the lieutenant governor actually stepped in and became governor for a few days. At the national level, women were rarely appointed to high offices before the 1990s. To be sure, 13 years after the 19th Amendment, Franklin Roosevelt appointed Frances Perkins as Secretary of Labor. And in the 1950s, Eisenhower upped that and actually appointed, he didn't up it. He appointed one woman to be Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, Oveta Hobby, who had served as head of the WACs during World War I. So there were 2 women cabinet members up until President Carter. And Presidents Carter, Reagan, and the first Bush, all of them appointed more than one token. All of them appointed 2 or 3 women as cabinet secretaries. Ronald Reagan, who we remember, put the first woman on the Supreme Court. But the more significant change in terms of women's appointment to high office came in the 1990s, when these appointments became more than tokens. Bill Clinton appointed the second woman to the Supreme Court, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, while O'Connor was still on the court. So doing away with the idea, oh, there's a woman's seat, and there can only be one woman at a time. Importantly, what Clinton did also was to appoint women to positions not traditionally associated with female traits, abilities, or interests. He named Janet Reno as Attorney General. He named, whoops, I'm a little behind. So there we have Sandra Day O'Connor. Clinton named Janet Reno as Attorney General. He named Madeleine Albright as his Secretary of State. And he named Ohio's own Mary Ellen Withrow as United States Treasurer. George Bush followed this pattern with his National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, and Obama with both his National Security Advisor and Secretary of State. I debated whether to add Trump, who did appoint Gina Haspel as head of CIA, which again is a non-traditional appointment, a high appointment, and non-traditional for a woman. By the 21st century, high appointed offices were no longer associated with masculinity, in other words. So how do we explain the changes in women's access to elective and appointed offices? We should remember that there were two periods of fairly intense change, the 1970s and the 1990s. In the 1970s, women's presence in state legislature shot up dramatically. In the 1990s, the same thing happened on the national level as women also broke barriers in appointed office. Much of this change was due to changes in women's actual lives. Since the 1940s, more and more women worked outside the home. More and more women had higher levels of education, outpacing men in undergraduate degrees by the 1990s. And by the late 1950s, women's childbearing levels had begun to decrease. Women were becoming less involved in childbearing and child-rearing and more involved in the public arena. And these changes also served as a catalyst for a new surge of women's rights activism in the late 1960s and 1970s. This surge of feminism, whoops, okay, this is where my PowerPoint broke down. I had some pictures of women marching and doing all kinds of stuff during the high tide of women's movements in the 1970s. But this rise of women's activism and demands for women's rights called attention to gender inequities and helped to secure laws that banned sex discrimination, a whole series of laws banning sex discrimination in various areas of women's lives. Voters became more receptive to women in political office as the new feminism raised public consciousness. It raised public consciousness. It also raised women's consciousness. And women began to develop greater self-confidence in themselves and more of a sense that they had a right to offices that were normally monopolized by men. So changes both in the attitudes of the general public, but also of women themselves. Title IX, we mentioned earlier, banning sex discrimination in education, it passed in 1972 and helped women get access to law schools, where they had never been more than 10% of students before the 1970s. The legal profession, of course, is probably the most typical avenue to a political career. So when women had access to law schools and the legal profession, it made a difference in their own confidence and in their ability to run for office. And since service in a state legislature is often a step to a higher office, often a step to Congress, the increasing numbers of women serving in state houses in the 1970s had an effect on the increasing number of women serving in Congress in the 1990s and beyond. The advances of women in American government in the last half century seem impressive to us, at least to me, until I compare the United States with other countries. While women constitute nearly a quarter of the current US Congress, they are represented in much greater proportion in countries around the world. Is this where my slide comes in? Good. For example, women make up more than 30% of national legislatures in countries like Britain, Germany, Argentina, Mexico, Iraq, Sweden, while we're still under 25% in the United States. And even with those recent gains in the 2018 elections, even with that recent jump, the United States ranks just 75th among all the nations in the world in terms of the proportion of women in legislatures. Moreover, while the 2008 elections saw two breakthroughs, 2008, the first woman ever to have a real chance at winning the presidential nomination, and the first woman ever on a Republican ticket, more than 50 women by 2008 had already served as heads of state around the world. Many of them reached that office because of family connections. Gandhi and Bhutto are two examples of women who got into those offices because of their fathers. But they served long terms and had influence. It wasn't a case of two prime ministers for the price of one. They served with their own authority. So some women did enter the highest office of their land through family connections, but many heads of states like Golda Meir, and the other PowerPoint had her picture, Margaret Thatcher, and Angela Merkel rose entirely on their own. By the time Hillary Clinton won the popular vote in the United States in 2016, 60 women had led nations such as Liberia, Australia, Norway, Chile, Finland, and Ireland. Why does the United States lag so far behind? For one thing, countries like Sweden and Norway are more committed to gender parity than is the United States. They're committed to gender parity not just in their political practices, but also in their policies regarding childbirth and child rearing. And actually, most of the European countries have more generous supports for child rearing than the United States does. Women do better in countries where political parties play stronger roles than they do in the United States. Most, if not all, of the heads of states were selected by their parties rather than by primaries. They were selected by their parties. And they were selected for their abilities, their ideas, their dedication, their history of support and working within the party. Contrasting this to the United States, we might wonder if democratic processes are really less friendly to women. Another factor in the difference between the United States and other countries is that about half the countries in the world use some kinds of targets or quotas at the party level, not at the election level, but at the party level, to move closer to gender balance. And the parties have accepted this because they got pressure from women. Parties want to, appeal to women. They've accepted it sometimes because public funding comes with meeting targets for gender parity. But for various reasons, political parties around the world have moved to a kind of affirmative action for women. And finally, women seem to have better opportunities in countries with parliamentary systems, in places with proportional representation rather than winner take all, and in preferential or ranked voting systems. They also do better in countries where elections are publicly financed. Women tend to be pretty successful in the United States in raising money. There's some research that suggests they don't like to do it even less than men. They don't like to raise money. And so public financing might be another difference between the greater success of women in other parts of the world. Turning the right to vote into a real presence for women in politics and government took nearly 100 years. Women during that time won parity and even a bit of superiority in terms of voting clout, because women vote in higher numbers and at a higher turnout rate than men. They've won election to Congress and most state legislatures in numbers sufficient enough to make a real difference in most state legislatures, maybe not Wyoming, where they're only 10%, and some of those states on the bottom level. Women have won election or appointment to all but a handful of the highest offices in the United States. Reaching full equality in politics and government will depend in part on women themselves. Once women decide to run, they win elections at about the same rate as men. And this is what some of the political science research shows, that there's not a big difference in the rate at which women win elections. But women have to choose to run, and this means that political parties, and right now especially the Republican Party, will need to identify and encourage women to run. Political action committees can also play a big role in encouraging women to run and getting them ready to run. The best example of that is Emily's List, an organization, a PAC, formed by Democratic Party women in the 1990s. It raised about $100 million in the 2018 elections, getting women into Congress and other seats. And in real parity, I think, will also depend on a continuing change in attitudes about gender and about who is most fit and less fit to hold office. 94% of Americans today tell pollsters that they would vote for a woman for president. And that seems really good. But if you start out in a race with a 6 percentage point deficit, that's a pretty formidable obstacle. So attitudes, while they have changed tremendously in terms of gender roles, are, I think, the last thing that could help women continue the progress that they have made into American politics and government since suffrage. Thank you. Yes.
I just want to point out that I've heard in the last few years that in the current cycle, we're starting to get more women running who are military.
Yes.
Interesting.
An important point, if you didn't hear it in the back, more women are running for office who are veterans, who are military veterans. And,
Senator Duckworth.
excuse me?
Duckworth, Illinois.
Yes. Yes, and I think the woman who's challenging Mitt, yeah, in Arkansas, Tennessee, where's he from?
Kentucky.
Kentucky, close. Like one of those New Yorkers who doesn't know the rest. Yes.
Have you done any comparisons on the trends of percentage of women that maybe had major, like are CEOs in major companies versus that trending on how they are in elected office, and also both the United States and the other countries that are ahead of us, they also are ahead in having women in leadership positions?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. How women do in terms of heading big companies or executive positions in big corporations. I don't think they're doing very well in the United States, but I'm not sure that they're doing better abroad. I just don't know. It'd be a good thing to research. Yes.
Ohio's very gerrymandered, and a lot of young, progressive, interested politicians are primary, and against people of the same party. I feel it's a very powerful, good step for opening up the conversation about what we can go, where we can go. How do you feel about that?
Say again. You started about gerrymandering. Yeah.
Well, you know, some districts are like even just all Democrat in Columbus, like Joyce Beatty. She's
Yes.
African American. She's been in about 3 or 4 terms, and there's a young politician that is primarying her, and I find it incredibly great. And I'm very progressive, so I want to hear the conversation, and I feel like it's good for our democracy. I am fed up with the gerrymander issue in Ohio, and hopefully that will change the next election, at least some gerrymandering. But what do you think about primary?
Well, I mean, it doesn't help if a woman, I mean, if we're just looking at the numbers of women, it doesn't help if a woman replaces a woman. But I think if women challenge men in primaries and they win that, you know, that would change. The gerrymandering in Ohio is I think, and I don't want to be partisan about that, saying this, but I think that's why we have so few women. Again, Democrats elect more women to state legislatures and to Congress, and if we had more women elected to Congress, more of them would be Democratic. I mean, half of the state is a swing state; it's 50-50. And yet only 4 of our Congress people are Democrat.
So you don't think it's a good idea, it's primary. As far as the political discussion,
Well,
I think it's an incredibly important thing to do.
I don't know how to answer that out of the context of women in politics. As I said, I think it wouldn't change a woman replacing a woman. But I think there are all kinds of reasons to challenge incumbents in primaries. I mean, there are lots of reasons, especially when they've been long-term incumbents and don't seem to, really be moving or doing anything.
I'm very interested in what you might have to say about when are we going to get a woman president?
Well, fortunately, I'm a historian, and we look back rather than. I don't know. I mean,
what forces will be at play, in your opinion, that would move the needle finally in that direction?
we already elected one.
We did.
I mean, I don't think that new forces have to come into play. I think the momentum is already there, that you have women with experience, you have experienced candidates. I do think if we had publicly financed elections, that would help. I think if we had limits on election contributions to elections, I think that would help. I do think some attitudes do need to change. I mean, there are expectations about women. A woman can still be too tough, not likable, not someone you want to sit down and have a beer with. So I think some attitude changes. I don't know. I have no idea how to predict what's going to happen in 2020. I think there's a good chance for a woman, but I'm not right now sure which one it would be even. Yeah.
I work in Washington with Congress as a lobbyist and a lawyer, and I am asked, and I work with both sides, Democrats and Republicans, but I am asked by Republican members, why can't we get more women to run for, Republican women to run for Congress? And it comes up frequently. I mean, my personal feeling is, and I told him this, I think it's because of guns and abortion, and not that, and on the abortion issue there are Democrats and Republicans who are against abortion, but I mean the extreme positions on abortion and guns. That's kind of why I think they have trouble recruiting women, but I'd like to know.
Well, yeah, and I don't know. I mean, I really just discovered this discrepancy. I'm kind of embarrassed to admit it while preparing for this. I knew there was a difference, but I didn't see that huge discrepancy in terms of Republicans and Democrats having women in elected office. So I'm not by any means an expert. I did see the New York Times had a very interesting 2 articles actually on the same page. I think it was this week, but they interviewed a lot of Republican women who were at some kind of workshop at Yale University to prepare women for office, and it was for women of both or all parties, I guess. And it asked a number of Republican women, and it wasn't just issues. The most important thing that came to mind, I just totally lost their responses. They did not get the encouragement from their parties. They do not have a PAC like Emily's List. They just started a PAC, but it spent $6 million in 2018 for Republican women, while Emily's List had $100 million. It had $6 million. So they also said, or 1 or 2 of the women also said that Republicans have a sense that women aren't conservative enough. that party, you know, that party men think that women are going to be not going to be conservative enough. That was an interesting thing that they said. And there are more Democratic women, as we saw, you know, from the gender gap, than there are Republican. I think Republican women, as a whole, tend to be less involved in public affairs. So, not as many of them have already been out there, you know, doing kind of political work. But I think the European countries have shown us that when the parties get involved, they will find you know, when they have a little bit of pressure, when they have some incentive, they'll find a way to cultivate female candidates. Yes?
Back on the presidential question, I mean, one dynamic that's different this year, which I think speaks to progress, I think the numbers I had seen, and I think in the history of presidential debates, there have been a total of 5 women that had participated, and there were 6 women this time around, and that both in the political specter and also in the private sector hiring specter, when you have multiple women
Yes.
candidates or multiple women applicants for a job, you're much more likely, because the woman isn't just a novelty, it becomes normalized. So, I mean, I think that's whether a woman's elected this time around or many elections down the road, that's a huge step that makes a big difference.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. It does kind of naturalize women as potential presidents, having them up on the debating stage and seeing more than one, seeing what, 6, 7, I don't know how many. So I think that's a good point. Yes.
I think one thing to help the women is to do more history about a man cannot be a president unless he has a strong wife. You know, and you can go to President Harding for that if you want. But basically, it's always been that way. The single man, there's no way he could be elected president. But the women.
Well, we had at least one single president. His daughter was
Who's that?
Garfield. Who was it? Garfield? Buchanan.
But you look at our presidents, and yes,
Yeah.
very intelligent, strong women as well.
Sure, and I mean, it's still the case that women do more of the, you know, in most families, that women do more of the caretaking of the family and take that load off of their husbands so that they can put everything that they have into preparing and running for office. That's changed a lot in the United States, but it hasn't totally changed. The surveys still, you know, still show a real difference in the amount of extra time or time that.
But what I was referring to is their influence on foreign policy, domestic policies, everything else, you know, in addition to raising families. But I mean, it is a one mind, you got 2 minds.
Yes, well, but you would have 2 minds if you had a woman president. You'd have her husband's.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think that picture up there tells you something about a woman president eventually. Margaret Thatcher had a tremendous personality, tremendous speaking ability. She came to the United States and, you know, talked about if she could run for president of America. And people ate it up because she had that kind of persona, that kind of strength, articulate. So it's going to be something, you know, Hillary suffered from some of that. So, you know, if you get someone with that kind of personality, there's some big impact. I don't care which party.
Yes.
Well, I personally happen to agree with that. I think that if the Democrats find somebody with real personality and with broad appeal, someone maybe, and I'm just throwing this out, like Kamala Harris, who could bring in, you know, different people into the fold. I saw that. I worked on President Obama's campaign in 2008, and I have never seen so many people excited. And that's what we were lacking this last time.
I think those are both good points, but it's harder for women to be charismatic, whatever, isn't it? Or, yeah.
I was involved in politics back in the 1970s, and there are lots of things that are harder for women. I mean, one of the things is that they generally spend more time with their younger children, so they enter politics like a little later in life than guys do. So,
Yes.
you know, the guys are able to develop some relationships. I was at two meetings, yeah, this is 1970s, I was at two meetings that I recall. One of them, there were about 20 people there, and one of them was a candidate, a woman candidate for a high office in the state. And the head of the Democratic Party was there, and he says, we're not going to invest any money in this race. So you've won the primary, you're doing this, but we don't see it as a winnable race. Another time, I was in a room, once again, with leaders of the Democratic Party, and there were like 200 women there, and the elections were coming up, and that's how it was, what you can do. And some woman had the temerity to ask, well, what do you want us to do? And the answer was, we want you to be mavens. I, of course, didn't know what that meant, but it means you go around and you talk to your friends, like the people when you're doing your grocery shopping or whatever, you talk to them about the election. This is not a bad thing, but, guys can do that too. I mean, why is this, and in any case, I think there are a lot of things that are traditionally and kind of hold women back. I think talks about, personality and about, whether they're good, ran a big company. Most of the guys, they don't have all these great personalities, all of them. I mean, you have people like Obama. You have some people that are, and I guess Ronald Reagan. But most, this is an expectation of women that you have some kind of a special personality. And women, many times, their professional careers are in not-for-profits much more than men. And in some ways, they are smarter and work harder because they have less to work with to get stuff done. So, and now my issue, and then I'll shut up. Now my issue is we've got these women there, and why isn't there more screaming about these kids down at the border and the way they're being treated? I mean, it seems to me that's a women's issue, and I would expect things to be a little bit different when you have more.
I think the women in Congress are screaming their heads off about what's going on in the border, but they don't have the power really to do much. And I think that Gary is. Thank you for your patience.